Good evening. Thank you for joining us. This is Live with Faye. We have a very interesting conversation lined up for you today. Before we go any further, I must tell my audience I can't really read the comments that you write on this video, but I will read them later. I accidentally spilled water on my computer, and so now I'm trying to get that fixed. So, in the meantime, we'll do the best with what we have. But there are perhaps more worrying things happening in the country than me messing up my laptop. To give you an example, 6 journalists, 1 former minister, sitting MP, are facing FIRs across 5 states of sedition for allegedly posting content on the internet. About 100 Twitter accounts were taken down for about 12 hours yesterday for also posting content that was apparently objectionable. Mandeep Punia, who is a freelance journalist who has now been granted bail, was arrested at the Singhu border and held by the police for, and I quote, obstructing a public servant in the discharge of public functions. And also the police said not carrying a press card. He has now been released on bail, but that case is worrying in general. What I want to do with this conversation, and enough of things have been said across the board, but I want to revisit the rules of journalism. Because I get the sense from the conversations we're having on Twitter that people have forgotten how journalism functions and what the rules are. Is it okay to make a mistake if you apologize for it? Does making a mistake in publishing something amount to sedition? There are journalists have functioned in this country for over 70 years. Is this worse than earlier, or was this always happening and are we hearing about it more now? Regular questions that ordinary citizens like you and I might be asking. To help us answer those questions, I have 2 very senior journalists who I respect greatly, Ms. Neerja Chowdhury and Mr. Javed Ansari, who have agreed to be part of this conversation. I welcome both of you and I thank you for your time. Thank you for agreeing to be part of this conversation. Ms. Chowdhury, I want to start with you first. You've been reporting on the ground and writing for decades in this country. Is this worse? Because there have been allegations on Twitter that this is an undeclared emergency. Do you see this as worse than actions that we've seen against journalists in the past? Because if we're being completely honest, there have been previous governments as well who've taken action against journalists.
No, Faye, I will say that it isn't like the emergency. Otherwise, you and I would not be talking like this.
Yes.
And many who have written critically and continue to write critically, you can say there's a lot of pressure that comes on those people. Troll armies, threatening them to surround their houses, threatening them with what will happen to them. We've heard recently, of a woman journalist who's been hounded, threatened with rape and her life. So that was not there. That is a new phenomenon that we are seeing, which is like vigilante groups.
Yes.
And they may be acting on behalf of the government or the ruling party. You cannot prove that link, but that is a suspicion, given the stand that they take. But to say that, emergency meant something, suspension of human rights, fundamental freedoms, press censorship, everything you wrote had to be subjected to the censor's pen. And, very simple, even exhortation to patriotism, to the Gandhian era, the Gandhian values, all that used to be also crossed out. Yet what is happening today is very worrying, because in this farm protest on the 26th January, if some people put out what were called unverified information, and remember it was a very so it was a day where very fast moving events were taking place, and a journalist had to report very quickly. You had no time to check out, so somebody called you and said, and you thought they were authoritative, you may have put it out, but the moment you realized that was not true, you took it back. Now, should unverified information, if that is true, and what the government will say maybe was fake information, if that is true, Does it invite the charge of sedition against a journalist? I believe that sedition is a charge that should not be ever used against journalists, unless it's in very extreme circumstances where you can prove things. Because the job of a journalist is to criticize the government, is to hold the government to account. And I would say, Faye, what we have been seeing is not just true, what happened on 26 January or some others. It has been happening in the States for a very long time. An uncomfortable journalist was under pressure, pressure was put to remove him or her from the job. We've seen this right from Jayalalitha's time. We've seen this.
Yes.
So it's been a worrying phenomenon, and now it's taking a different shape at the national level. So I think we've got to take note and see what to do.
And this is important because sedition, for the benefit of our audience who aren't familiar with it, sedition is effectively a crime against the nation. It is a crime when you plot to destabilize the nation in some way. Sedition was also a law written by the British when the British ruled this country as a tool they used to actually prosecute those who were demanding freedom, because they saw that as destabilizing their rule. Incidentally, governments after governments in India, knowing full well that sedition has no place in a free and independent country, in a democracy, have not gotten rid of it, because it's also helpful for these successive governments to remove criticism. And it is the same sedition that is being used again. Mr. Ansari is also with us. Mr. Ansari, I also want to point out a very interesting article by Article 14. Article 14 is a great website that's doing work on legal nuances in all of these stories. They've actually pulled out a database saying since 2010, 96% of the sedition cases have been brought for criticizing politicians. Now, criticizing politicians, like Neerja ji pointed out, is the job of a journalist, and hence cannot be seen as sedition. But Mr. Ansari, I'm going to ask you for a day one journalism class here. Ms. Chowdhury said that when events are moving fast, there might be some unverified reports that do come in. There's obviously human error. Things go on air or things get published, and then later you take it down and you apologize. Does that amount to a crime of some sort, especially if there is, let's say, for argument's sake, some sort of a volatile environment, a riot, or like the events we saw the 26th of January? What are the rules and the ethics of journalism in these cases?
It's not uncommon to make that kind of mistake. I'm sure all of us, and Neerja ji, the amount that she's forgotten, we will never learn about journalism. It's a fact. But even she will bear us out that in the heat of the moment, especially in a developing story, you have to, and given the nature of the beast that television is, you have to run with the news. Maybe sometimes there is not enough time to cross-check. You go with the news. In this case, there is a clear timeline. The moment Rajdeep Sardesai, at around 10 minutes past 2, Rajdeep Sardesai, the farmers told him that there is one of us has been killed and he's been shot by the police. He gave the farmers version. Within 10 minutes or 12 minutes, the Delhi police put out a video, put out a disclaimer saying that no, this is not true. And soon thereafter, they put out a video. Rajdeep Sardesai, to his credit and to the channel's credit, they immediately withdrew the story and even put out the story saying that this is not true. The fact is that he died. He did not die of bullet wounds. Now, if you have some other agenda, if you want to penalize somebody for the slip, and what Rajdeep is guilty of, all of us have been guilty of at some point or the other in our journalistic careers. If you've been in a live reporting scenario, in a live scenario, these kind of things happen. There is something called the slip of the tongue. There's something called on the spur of the moment, you go with what you have and then correct it. And to penalize somebody with sedition for acting against the nation, I mean, this just beats me. Neerja ji said that this is not like the emergency. Yes, I agree with her partly. In emergency, there was no freedom of speech. Now now the question is there freedom after speech? That's the difference. In my view, that's the difference. Whether there is freedom after speech. I'm speaking today, who knows tomorrow what will happen. But that apart, I mean, this kind of thing. And what happens? The Supreme Court and the High Court, Allahabad High Court, have made it abundantly clear that all the reporting with relation to the Tablighi Jamaat's involvement in spreading corona was false, was motivated, and was absolutely baseless. Has any action been taken? This is the courts that have ruled, leave alone my subjective judgment or yours. This is the judgment of the learned judges of the Allahabad High Court, as also other courts. What action has been taken? What action has been taken about this, has been taken against the gentleman who went to Sindhu border yesterday and said that hamare inko jute se maro, unko goli maro? I mean, what action has been taken against Kapil Mishra for inciting mobs during the Northeast Delhi riots? So, you're acting against, you turn a deaf eye here, you turn a blind eye to politicians who do this, and you slam journalists with, you slam journalists with sedition charges just because you don't agree with them. You want to silence journalists. You want to send out a message that if you're not with us, then be prepared to face the music. And let's face it, not everybody can face this music. It's a hats off to Punia that he's been, he stood his ground and he's now been released, and the courts have acted with alacrity. But imagine 6 cases in Madhya Pradesh, in UP, in Delhi, only in places where, which are run by a particular party. What kind of a thing is that? So tomorrow, some other state government, which is run by, say, one of the opposition parties, starts acting against people who are saying this will, I mean, this is a point of no return there. All hell will break loose.
Actually, so that's a really important point. Ms. Chaudhary, I want to bring you in on this. There are now 5 different states that have filed the same sedition case against these journalists, including the state of Karnataka, that was nowhere near or anywhere involved in what happened in Delhi on the 26th of January. Is this a warning shot for all journalists to sort of?
Of course, Faye. They are meant to be the message to all journalists. I agree with everything that Javed is saying. These are big names. I mean, you can disagree with Raj Desai's views. That you may say, if you're on the government side, you will say, okay, he's against the government, he's critical. You can disagree with the Caravan reporting, which I think is one of the finest reporting today in India. The kind of stories that Caravan has done over the years. So meticulously researched, critical, which it's the job of a journalist to be. Mridal Pandey, she's a big name.
And she's 75 years old.
Forget the 75 years old. Of course, she's 75 years old. These are top names, credible names in Indian journalism today. So if you bring charges against them, what are you saying to the entire journalistic community? Watch out. If this can happen to them, it can happen to you. Yeah. And as I was saying, you can, Rajdeep may be critical of the Narendra Modi government, but if you look at Rajdeep's stories night after night, he gives 2 sides of the whole story. If he's, talking about an issue, we've seen it night after night. So I agree that in the heat of the moment, you can make mistakes. We've all made mistakes, even though we wanted to check on facts, because that is what we've been brought up to do in journalism. That our journalism that, we cut our teeth in. Mm-hmm. So given that, it is, as I said at the outset, it is a worrying phenomenon. You cannot, because in the emergency, there was a formal suspension of fundamental rights. Reasons for arrest need not be given. Reasons for anything. You could take recourse to law. And, those kind of things were formally put in place. But certainly, as I say, it is a very worrying phenomenon, particularly what's happening to journalists. This is happening in Delhi, but day after day, things have been happening in the state capitals, in different corners of different states.
Yes.
But I'm saying this is, over the years, state governments have also done what is today happening.
Because it's been normalized in the states that, it's now sort of spreading.
I remember being name of Tamil Nadu.
Yes.
Well, whether or not it was, I remember being sent to Tamil Nadu to cover something because a local journalist could not write critically about the Jayalalitha. And this is decades ago. So, let's look at the situation. And, when you have nowhere to go, if this kind of thing's happening, and you don't have confidence that the judiciary will give you justice. Today, there is a question mark there. If you knock on the doors of the court and say, this is my right, which is being violated, will you get justice? It's a big question mark today in the country hanging out there. And a lot of people don't have that confidence.
I want to now just step back and look at the larger picture of what we're looking at over the last 1 month. Munawar Farooqui, the comedian, is still in jail for a joke he allegedly has not made yet. For a joke he was planning on making, and the last I checked, at least, we can't be prosecuted for something we've not done yet in this country. There were several Twitter accounts that were blocked or taken down for over 12 hours yesterday, including that of the Caravan magazine, and several other people and activists and things like that. There is now a sense of, do we really want to say it? Can we do without making this statement, given what's happening to shows like Thunder, given what's happening? So everybody is now perhaps rethinking what they're going to say before they say it. Where does that then leave us? And of course, journalism is at the forefront of that, because there's journalism, there's art, there's culture, there's comedians, there's writers. All of this together provides society with a mirror sometimes of the uncomfortable what's that society doesn't want to see. Is there a change in the status of freedom of speech in our country? Ms. Chowdhury, you first.
Yes, there is a growing intolerance in the country that you can't have a stand-up comedian before the stand-up comedian has had his say. But even if he'd had his say and was very sharp and, irreverent, which comedians are and should be, and one should be able to look at it and take it as a society. One should be able to laugh at yourself. If that cannot happen, then what is the conclusion you come to? That we are growing to be very intolerant of views that we don't agree with.
Mr. Ansari?
And as I said, there are groups, sorry?
Yes. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
And there are groups who are allowed to shout them down. And no action is taken against them. So you create a climate of fear, the normal work, which they were doing yesterday and could do yesterday. And today it's become that much more difficult. So yes, you are creating a very suffocating climate as far as free speech is concerned. It may not be through a formal decree.
Mr. Ansari, what are the dangers to our democracy of a climate that threatens free speech? If we all stop saying what's on our mind, if journalists stop criticizing establishment, if comedians stop making jokes, if artists stop, creating the art or the films, and writers stop writing, or at least hesitate, what is the danger of that?
Then I'm sorry, we're heading into a very dark alley, because this is something, then our worst nightmares will have come true. This is not who we are, or at least who we used to be. These are not signs of a free, modern, pluralistic society in which the state is not afraid to listen to criticism. And if that happens, and if you have to look, as we now are increasingly doing, over our shoulder repeatedly, every word we speak, you need to weigh, you need to be conscious. As journalists, the very definition of a journalist's relationship with those in authority is adversarial. It can't be pally-vally. This is a lesson that was drilled into us by my bosses when we were. You can't be friendly. You have to have an adversarial relationship. Be fair. Certainly be fair. Carry their point of view, but don't become chums. And if you suddenly become, apart from being chums, if we suddenly are expected to be only cheerleaders, then why then they already
so
have
answer this question for me,
they
Mr.
already
Ansari.
have
There
the
are a lot of
PIB.
people. There are a lot of people who write to me saying, "Oh, but you never appreciate the government. You never sort of appreciate any good work. You never sort of write about the good stuff. You only criticize." Now, in my opinion, there is a paid a bureaucrat occupies a position of the public relations officer in every single government office who's paid to do that job. That is not my job. But do you think that, and do you think by definition, and I just want to clarify this for audiences who I believe might have forgotten, by definition, journalists are meant to be anti-establishment. That's the job. It's like cops and robbers. You cannot have cops who are pro-robbers.
I don't know who these people are who are saying that we never praise the government, because now you can count on your fingertips the number of people who question the government. There are media outlets, I don't want to name them, but the whole world knows who do nothing but cheerlead, who act as cheerleaders for the government. There is, in my own view, there is not enough questioning of those in authority. People are not being held to account, and that's the reason. And because you questioned, it doesn't mean that you're against the government or you don't love this country. I also love my country as much as anybody else does, but I have a right to question. If I believe that something is not being done, or the rules are being bent, or something is not being done or delivered, we have a right to point out. We pointed it out in previous governments, and we, if allowed to do so, will do it with this government as well. Unless, of course, the definition of journalism has changed. If journalism only means publishing printouts, handouts given by PIB, then what is the point of having journalists? Just publish in toto whatever the PIB is saying, or the PRO, Railway Ministry PRO is saying, or the Civil Aviation Ministry is saying, and the end of story. Then what is the point? If a journalist can be charged for sedition in UP for pointing out that the midday meal is a scam, that for midday meals, kids are being served salt and stale chapatis. If that is a crime against the nation, then all of us should be sent to the gallows, leave alone be charged. That's a service to the nation, in my view. But if you point out a taxpayer's money, that is, we pay taxes so that these kind of schemes can be run, and if that is being misused, and if we point it out and then you are charged with sedition, then I think that this is a very lenient law. Please send us to the gallows straight away.
Absolutely. I want to point out to our audience, I want to take the same point back to Ms. Chowdhury. I want to remind our audience that this year is the 40th anniversary of Ms. Neerja Chowdhury winning the Chameli Devi Award for women journalists in this country.
My God.
Now, when you work for at least 40 years, you wind up criticizing a different government every 4 years, 10 times over. And so, people who believe that journalists are now being really hard on this government have got it wrong. The UPA 1, UPA 2, the scams came out of the closet because journalists exposed them. There were journalists working in every single government. Ms. Chowdhury, is there a need now to remind the Indian audience the job or the function of a journalist and journalism in a democracy?
Yes, I think it's sad, your question, that you have to remind people what is the function of a journalist in a democracy. for us to expose, as we've all done, governments have gone, chief ministers have been toppled as a result of stories that you wrote. I remember my first story being sexual assaults on juveniles, teenagers in the Tihar jail. And the person who was heading the prisons, the IG, was a college friend of my husband's. So the kind of tehelka that there was, at various levels. But it was a given. This is something you did. So I find it, what you say, having to remind yourself and others, society, the basic rights of a journalist, which come from the fundamental rights given to you under the Constitution. Now, I'm not saying, I think Javed was saying that, of course, you've got to give the other side, even if you believe the other side is telling an untruth. You've got to be fair. I believe in that. No matter what the other side, there are two sides to a story, and you must bend over backwards to give that other side.
Yeah.
But that does not mean that the job of a journalist is, as Javed said, to do PR for the government, or to, what is the view that the government has about what media is supposed to do? Is to propagate their views, propagate their achievements. Is that there needs to be maybe a more fundamental debate. And I'm surprised because the BJP was amongst those who took up the jhanda for press freedom during the emergency years. Their leaders were in prison. Their leaders talked about the freedom of the media, freedom of the judiciary. So they've been through that whole process.
Yes.
And now, I suppose every government wants to manage the media, wants to, constrict those freedoms. It's very tempting. It's not very nice for them to have themselves be criticized day after day. But there are Lakshman Rekhas that have existed, and you don't cross them. Wise leaders don't cross them.
Are those being crossed now?
You look at, well, yes, these 6 is a very disquieting development, Faye. This FIR against these 6 journalists. It's a new milestone. And let me say this to you that, even what happened that night, I'm digressing from the media thing, but Rakesh Tiket's tears got people from the villages come back to Delhi to protest. You felt the movement was now going to peter out and the violent elements had taken over, and few wanted that to happen. Nobody will make a case for violence. What did it represent? It represented a response to the arrogance of power, a helpless, frustrated response, those tears, which got people thronging the capital again. And, Indian citizens, Indian voters put up with a lot of sins on behalf of their parties and politicians, but they do react to arrogance of power. We've seen this in the past. We saw it when, in the 1977 elections, against, the sentiment against Indira Gandhi, which threw her out of power. In North India, completely wiped out. So I'm saying, I'm mentioning this because I've been reading up in recent days that whole chapter of the emergency period. So it would be good for parties to remember, arrogance of power, and that arrogance of power gets manifested in many ways, and therefore the desire to, act against journalists who are not comfortable. It's all part of that whole scheme.
Mr. Ansari, there is a question my team tells me from Aman Peshawari, who says that there are mainstream, and you alluded to it a little bit, which is why I'm coming back to you, mainstream media outlets who put out fake news, don't apologize, don't take it down. And so it becomes then difficult for audiences to be able to tell what is fake, what is real. And it's also, if the three of us are going to be completely honest, led to a massive erosion of the respect the journalists command and the credibility that journalists, the profession commands in this country as well. What is your advice to ordinary citizens who are watching? How should they sift the grain from the shaft and be able to tell that, okay, this is credible, this is not credible, I should watch this, I should not watch this, this is what I should read? How do they do that?
It's a very difficult situation to be in. If had I not been from the media, had I not had the kind of access that I have had or have still continue to have, I wouldn't know what to make of it, because there we can't deny the fact that the television, especially electronic media, has a huge impact. The reach is so much. So the damage, once they put out a story, right or wrong, the damage is already done. And now because there is no accountability, so they continue to do it day after day after day, and people start to believe it. And especially in a situation where the other point of view either doesn't get play, or if it does, it's just wished away in a second and a half. So look at the kind of prominence that something else does, and look at what happens in of our contrarian view. There are very few channels who are there are very few notable exceptions. By and large, now the electronic media is just drum beating and following one line, and as a result of which there is very difficult. So I often feel, in my colony or people that I know, they'll ask me, and then when I try and give them another sort of, no, but the media was saying this, they will say, but what are you saying? What you're saying is totally different from what television channels are showing or what your colleagues are writing about. So, I mean, I really don't know. And I know of enough reporters in the field who still have their hearts and minds in the right place and who want to tell the truth as they see it. But I don't know, somewhere the bosses have been arm twisted, or what happens that, there is a live example. Just the other day, there were youth who were throwing stone at the protesters at Singhu border. And there was this reporter who showed it for a minute, because that was something live, and that was any journalist was expected to do. She was just doing a job. She showed that the police is standing by while these people are pelting stone at the protesters. And not only was that package taken off air, the anchor never even went back to her. So what do you say? She never featured in the subsequent news bulletins. So what do you say to this? I mean,
she also, if I'm not mistaken, got a phone call live on air where she actually responded saying, "मैं hyperbolic नहीं बोल रही हूँ, मैं सच बोल रही हूँ." Where she was actually asked. Yeah. So
I missed out that one. But this is a very sorry state of affairs. I mean, I'd hate to be in a situation like this if I was a reporter. I mean, sometimes I thank my stars that I've retired and I'm not in a live reporting situation where I'm not faced with this kind of a risk. Because, either I would have had to quit or I would have been sacked. If I didn't agree, if I didn't follow, I would have been sacked. And if I did what I ought to have done, then the consequences.
So actually, I want to ask you both this. This is my last question. It's always very dangerous when an anchor says, this is my last question. My last question is your advice for journalists right now. There are so many young people, hoping to be journalists. There are those who are journalists right now who are holding their pen and saying, do we write? Do we not write? Should we hold back? Should I be writing about entertainment and lifestyle? Is that a safer, easier way to live? Is there really room for this trade, this skill in this country right now? Ms. Chowdhury, what is your advice to journalists across the country who are now nervous?
Faye, knowing the reality on the ground, knowing the way the pressures on media houses, what advice do you give journalists? As I agree with Javed that I'm not one of those who believes that the younger journalists coming in are not doing their duty. Some of them are doing very well.
Absolutely.
Very courageously. you take your hats off to them that they are doing it so courageously in the given circumstances, with all kinds of pressures. So, societal pressures, you don't know who's going to attack you, your own pressures from the media, from the government, from the corporates. I mean, in our time, we faced this, but not like, in the emergency, we faced it, but not otherwise, not like this. There were, of course, corporate pressures. There were limitations also imposed. So and so is somebody who's a holy cow you don't write about, but it wasn't a general kind of a thing. So I would take my hat, I would salute them, those who are in the field, and all courage to them. And I would say, Faye, that we should, and I made this suggestion, we should get a pooling in of resources of those who have now been facing sedition charges. How are they managing? This is happening in states. So many journalists in the states, we react when there are big names involved, have been facing this kind of thing. And we should every month have a tracker of what's happening to whom. How are they managing? How are their families managing? How can we help in that kind of a situation? And short of saying, I continue to do what I am called to do as long as I can do it, is the only thing I can say, And that's the best we can do. And that is the best we can better. We must better because we all went into journalism because we wanted to show the mirror to society. We could have set up another dukan somewhere or gone into business or, doing now, as you say, entertainment writing, it is safe. But because we believed that we owed this to society. And I'm also, Javed, very pained by this incident of, the midday meal that came. बच्चों को सूखी रोटी और नमक आप दे रहे हो और उस पे कोई आपको दिखाए कि हो रहा है. I would have thought that Chief Minister, that government would have said, thank you very much, we will correct it within hours. We've seen that corrected. I've been to Anganwadis in the last years and, done this and tried to bring this to light. So what could be, in every government things go wrong. It's the duty of the media to show this to the government of the day. So these are really painful things happening, but I would say, salute those journalists who are doing their work in the field.
Absolutely. Mr. Ansari, any advice for journalists?
It's always a very, very difficult task to better what Neerja Chowdhury did. Even when she was reporting, she always set the bar so high that all of us could just hope to, somehow. So whatever she said, I think is the last word. It would be very easy for me sitting, now that I've retired, to tell my colleagues that just do your job, to hell with the consequences. No, it cannot. I'm at a stage in life where I have more years behind me than ahead of me. And so therefore, one has to be cautious. All one can say is, let's do our job. I've never believed in self-censorship. Do our job, be fair, and do your job, do what is expected of you. If people want to censor, drop your stories, let the onus be on the others. Continue doing the good work that you're doing. As Neerja ji said, there are so many young girls and boys out there in the field who at great risk to themselves are doing a tremendous amount of work. I'd be very proud to have done half the work that they're doing. I can name people, but I don't want them to get into trouble. They're doing a fantastic job. Continue doing what you're doing. And this too will end. This too shall pass. Nothing in life is permanent. These dark times will also end. Hopefully in my lifetime.
Well, I want to thank both of you, but I want to leave just one thought with our audience. It's an analogy I share with people when they ask me these questions about journalism. Imagine if I asked you to clean your house of pests and dirt and everything else without any lights, in pitch darkness, where you couldn't see where the dirt was, where the rat is, where the cockroach is. You can't see anything. How will you clean your house? And you love your house. You live in your house. You want it to be clean. Journalism is the light. It shines a light on the problems so that the government, the citizens, the bureaucracy can fix those problems. Because this country is a house that we all live in. This is our home, and we want it to constantly be improved. And if you didn't have journalists to turn on the light, you have no idea what's going on in your house. You'd have no idea how many pests there were, how much rot there was, and how much, how many problems there were, how many taps were leaking that needed to be fixed. And then by the time you found out, if at all, it would be too late. Think of it like that. If your roof was leaking, you need to acknowledge that leaking roof in order to fix it. You can't pretend it's not happening because it embarrasses the house or the family to point out a leaking roof. That's how we fix things. That's how we improve things. And journalists who are doing their work today are doing it at great personal risk, at risk to their mental health and their physical safety, and at much against, let me point out, the advice of their family members who are asking all of them to just stop, give it up, and do something easier. Because at the end of the day, that's what family members want, right? They want you to be safe. So the next time you see a journalist being criticized, bullied, threatened on social media, stand up for that journalist. It's the least you can do. Support independent journalists, find credible sources, and find a way to support this profession, because without it, there is no democracy. Ms. Neerja Chowdhury, Mr. Javed Ansari, thank you first of all for all the work you have done for this country and all the contributions you all have made through your journalism. And thank you for this masterclass in the rules of journalism and freedom of speech. Thanks for watching.